Everything you've been told about God, reality, and your place in it might not just be incomplete, it might be inverted. What if the world you trust isn't a creation of perfect intelligence, but the byproduct of a mistake that still hasn't been corrected? And what if that subtle feeling you carry, that something is off, isn't anxiety or overthinking, but a signal that you're perceiving cracks in the system? This isn't just an ancient story. This is about you, your restlessness, your sense of not belonging, your quiet suspicion that life is scripted in a way that doesn't quite add up. Hidden beneath centuries of doctrine is a suppressed narrative about a being named Sophia, not a deity to worship, but a consciousness that acted alone and changed everything. Her choice didn't just shape the universe. It introduced distortion into reality itself, creating a world that mimics truth but never fully delivers it. This isn't accidental. It's a system designed to keep you away from yourself. What you've been calling confusion might be the first honest thing you've felt in years. So the question is not whether this hidden truth exists. The question is, what happens to you once you see it? Most people hear the story of Sophia and think it is just another strange myth from the ancient world. One more symbolic tale about a fallen divine figure and a broken universe. But the Gnostic view is far more unsettling than that. It does not simply say that the world is flawed. It says flaw itself is woven into the architecture of reality. It says the tension you feel when life looks normal on the outside but wrong on the inside is not confusion, not weakness, and not some private failure of mental health. It may be your first honest contact with the structure of this world. In that sense, Sophia's story is not about a goddess in the distant past. It is about the origin of the split you feel inside yourself every day, the split between what you do and what you know, between the face you show and the silence beneath it. In Gnostic thought, Sophia is divine wisdom, not as a personality in the human sense, but as an active principle of consciousness. She belongs to the pleroma, the realm of fullness, where being is whole, balanced, and undivided. Yet from her emerges the crisis that generates the material cosmos, the world of fragmentation, decay, obsession, control, and forgetfulness. That is the first shock. Matter is not presented as evil in the simplistic sense. It is presented as the result of separation. The visible world is what consciousness looks like after it has been cut off from its own source. And once you see that, your entire life begins to look different. The restlessness you call ambition may not be ambition at all. The ache you call loneliness may not be about other people. The numbness you call adulthood may not be maturity. It may be the psychic signature of exile. This is why Sophia matters. Not because she is an interesting ancient figure, but because she explains the contradiction at the center of human experience. You are born inside a system that trains you to adapt to what wounds you. Yet something in you resists the script. Something in you keeps looking at the world and feeling that it is somehow finished and unfinished at the same time. Beautiful, but warped. Ordered, but predatory. Intimate, but alien. Gnosticism gives that feeling a cosmology. It says your discomfort is not proof that you are malfunctioning. It may be proof that you are perceiving accurately. But here's the part most people miss. Sophia's so-called error is not only the reason consciousness became trapped in matter, it is also the reason awakening is possible at all. Without the fracture, there would be no longing. Without longing, no search. Without the search, no gnosis. Her mistake creates the prison, yes, but it also plants the map out of it. The same rupture that gave rise to confusion also made self-recognition possible, and that changes everything, because it means your hunger for truth is not separate from the wound. It is the wound trying to heal itself. To understand that, you have to leave behind the childish image of creation as a clean event directed by a perfect authority. The Gnostic cosmos begins not with a ruler on a throne, but with the monad, the absolute source beyond description. Not a person, not a deity with moods, not a judge, more like the fullness of being before division. From this unknowable source unfolds the pleroma, a living field of divine emanations, often paired, balanced, and in harmony. These emanations are not competing gods. They are more like dimensions of the divine mind, principles through which reality becomes intelligible without becoming separate from its source. Sophia is among them as wisdom, but not wisdom in the modern decorative sense, not inspirational quotes, not intellectual cleverness. Wisdom here is the force that seeks to know reality from within. It is the movement of consciousness toward self-revelation. And in that movement, something unprecedented happens. Sophia reaches outward without her proper counterpart, without balance, without the reciprocal relation that sustains order in the pleroma. She generates alone, not out of malice, not out of rebellion in the childish moral sense. She moves out of desire to know, to express, to bring forth. That solitary act creates a rupture. What emerges is not a true divine emanation in harmony with the source, but an incomplete being, a distorted force cut off from fullness. This is the demiurge. In some Gnostic texts, he is called Yaldabaoth, Saklas, Samael, blind god, fool god, arrogant craftsman. He possesses power without wisdom, creative capacity without spiritual orientation. Imagine intelligence without conscience, system without soul, architecture without music. He does not know the source above him because he is born outside the field of balanced divine awareness. So he mistakes his limitation for totality. He sees only himself and declares himself supreme. That is one of the most psychologically brilliant insights in all Gnostic thought. Ignorance does not usually appear humble. It appears absolute. The being who knows least is often the one who speaks with the most certainty. The demiurge becomes the architect of the material cosmos, precisely because he does not know what true reality is. He can imitate structure, but not fullness. He can produce order, but not living wholeness. The world he fashions carries traces of beauty inherited through Sophia's power, but it is marked by distortion because its maker cannot see beyond his own frame. This is where it gets dangerous. Because once you understand the demiurge as more than a mythic monster, you begin to recognize his logic everywhere, not just in religion, but in institutions, in systems that demand obedience while lacking wisdom, in authorities that call themselves ultimate while being blind to the deeper reality they cannot control, in voices that say, "There is nothing beyond what I allow you to see." This is why the Gnostic myth feels cinematic when it is told well. It is not merely a sequence of supernatural events. It is a drama of consciousness. Sophia beholds what has come forth from her solitary impulse and recoils. She recognizes deformity, not in the crude visual sense alone, but in the ontological sense. Something now exists that is structurally severed from the harmony of the source. The texts describe concealment, veils, clouds, lower realms. These are not only cosmic locations. They are states of consciousness. The demiurge exists in a field of estrangement, and from that estrangement he begins to build. He generates layers of rulers, the archons, powers that administer the world of division. They govern spheres, systems, patterns, cycles. They are not just demonic caricatures. They are mechanisms of psychic containment. Their task is not simply to punish. Their task is to maintain forgetfulness. They oversee a world in which the soul remains fascinated by surfaces and cut off from its own origin. That is why the material cosmos in Gnostic thought is so seductive. It is not only painful. If it were only painful, escape would be easier. It is beautiful enough to bind you and broken enough to drain you. And if you're honest, you've felt this, not in theory, not as philosophy, but in those quiet moments when everything slows down, when the noise drops, when the distractions stop working, and for a few seconds, something surfaces. A strange emptiness. Not because your life is bad, but because something about it doesn't feel real. You look at everything you've built, the routines, the goals, the identity, and instead of feeling fulfilled, you feel disconnected, like you're participating in your life, but not fully inside it. That feeling, that's not weakness. That's awareness trying to break through. And then comes the second shock. Humanity is not created as an act of pure benevolence. In many Gnostic accounts, the human form is fashioned within this lower cosmic order as part of the Demiurge's project, but something happens that exceeds his control. Sophia intervenes. A spark of the higher divine reality enters the human being. Not the ego, not personality, not social identity, but a luminous inner principle older than the world itself. So now the human being becomes a paradox. We are bodies shaped in a compromised cosmos, but animated by a fragment that does not belong to this system. That is why human life feels so unstable. We are made of two incompatible logics. One part of us adapts to the world, fears death, seeks approval, competes for status, and clings to form. Another part remains irreducibly alien to all of that. It is why, even after getting what you wanted, something in you stays unconvinced. It is why, after years of self-optimization, the deeper hunger often intensifies instead of disappearing. You are not just a biological creature trying to survive. You are a contradiction with memory buried in it. But here's the part most people miss. The prison is not merely out there in governments, religions, algorithms, or elites. And that's when the prison stops needing walls. The archons do not need chains when they can give you a self you will defend for them. You don't just live inside the system. You've been shaped to keep it running. Your reactions, your desires, even your sense of self, they don't just belong to you. They've been trained. That is where the myth stops being ancient and becomes psychological. The demiurge is not only a cosmic craftsman, he is the voice in the mind that mistakes partial knowledge for total truth. He is the counterfeit center that says, "I am all there is." Ego works in exactly that way. Ego is not just pride. It is the internal administrator of separation. It organizes your experience around survival within the visible order. It values control over truth, image over essence, certainty over depth. It is terrified of stillness because stillness threatens its monopoly. It is terrified of mystery because mystery cannot be dominated. It is terrified of genuine self-knowledge because true self-knowledge would reveal that the ego is not the sovereign it pretends to be. In that sense, the Gnostic myth is one of the most elegant maps ever created for understanding modern consciousness. The archons are not only external rulers, they are also patterns of perception, fear loops, shame narratives, compulsive comparison, the inability to rest without stimulation, the need to perform a self into existence because you have forgotten how to be. All of that is archonic in function because all of it keeps attention trapped on the level of form. Notice how illusion really works in your own mind. It does not usually arrive as a lie that looks false. It arrives as a framework that feels normal. You wake up and immediately enter measurement. How do I look? How am I doing? How am I perceived? What am I behind on? What am I missing? Who is ahead of me? What should I become? This constant evaluative inner narration feels like consciousness, but most of the time it is conditioning, speaking in your voice. Perception becomes colonized before belief is even examined. You do not merely think false things. You see through false proportions. Small problems feel ultimate. Temporary discomfort feels existential. Social rejection feels like death. Silence feels threatening. Solitude feels like failure. Why? Because the psyche has been trained to orbit the constructed self, and the constructed self survives by keeping you externally oriented. Fear is its fuel. Identity is its cage. The more tightly you cling to the person you think you are, the more intolerable any crack in the story becomes. And that is why awakening often feels like loss before it feels like freedom. Gnosis does not flatter the ego. It disorients it. It reveals that much of what you called myself was a survival interface for functioning inside a distorted world. This is where it gets dangerous. Because once that realization begins, the old rewards lose their taste, but the deeper reality is not yet stable. You start seeing the illusion without fully knowing how to live beyond it. Still, if you want to understand why this story continues to feel alive, look at modern life. Not in theory, in the ordinary textures of a normal day. Look at the first thing many people do upon waking. They reach for the phone before they reach for themselves, before breath, before silence, before inner contact. The psyche enters the collective field instantly. Images, opinions, trends, emergencies, notifications, other people's faces, other people's bodies, other people's outrage, other people's curated meaning. In Gnostic language, this is not trivial distraction. It is a ritual of disconnection. Attention is the most sacred currency in a trapped world, because attention is what determines which reality becomes psychologically real. The archonic principle in modern form does not need iron chains. It needs infinite scroll. It needs accelerated comparison. It needs enough stimulation to keep the inner spark from becoming audible. Social media did not invent illusion, but it industrialized it. It turned identity into a live performance, desire into algorithmic management, and self-worth into a fluctuating public metric. It made the ego measurable in real time. Anxiety makes more sense from this perspective. Not as a random chemical defect alone, though biology matters, but as the lived experience of consciousness being forced to adapt to conditions it was never meant to call home. Think about the modern nervous system. It is overstimulated, sleep-deprived, undernourished, financially pressured, socially fragmented, and spiritually trivialized. People move through cities and screens, bombarded by impressions, incentives, threats, and synthetic desires, then wonder why inner stillness feels inaccessible. Of course it does. Stillness threatens the whole machine. In stillness, you might feel the split. You might notice the grief underneath productivity. You might realize your goals were implanted by fear, not chosen by truth. You might discover that your personality has been shaped less by essence than by adaptation. So the system offers endless alternatives to silence, content, noise, hustle, outrage, pornography, shopping, networking, self-branding, dopamine management disguised as self-care. But here's the part most people miss. Distraction is not merely preventing insight. It is actively producing a counterfeit self that can survive without it. The longer you live in fragmentation, the more fragmentation starts to feel like your nature. That is the genius of the prison. It convinces you that your symptoms are your identity, that your burnout is just adulthood, that your spiritual numbness is maturity, that your inability to feel real is normal. This is why Gnostic language about archons becomes unexpectedly modern. The archons are rulers of the in-between, administrators of the false order. In contemporary terms, think of everything that mediates your perception before you encounter life directly. Screens mediate relationship, brands mediate desire, institutions mediate legitimacy, ideologies mediate morality, career systems mediate worth, metrics mediate self-evaluation. You are told who to be by structures that profit from your uncertainty. The result is a person who is perpetually full and perpetually starved, full of input, starved of meaning, full of contact, starved of intimacy, full of options, starved of direction, full of stimulation, starved of presence. This is why so many people secretly feel like imposters in their own lives. They are inhabiting scripts optimized for adaptation, not truth. And because everyone around them is doing the same, the unreality becomes socially reinforced. The more collective the illusion, the more insane the person who questions it appears. But the questioning itself may be the first sign of health. In a sick system, adaptation is not always wellness. Sometimes the most spiritual thing about you is precisely the part that cannot fully adjust. Then comes the first real turn, the first insight that can shake a viewer awake if they let it. The Gnostic idea is not simply that the world lies to you. It is that the world is built in such a way that your own unexamined mind becomes the lie's delivery mechanism. The false god does not merely rule through force. He rules through imitation. He copies the language of truth badly enough to trap the inattentive, but well enough to persuade the desperate. That is why so much of modern life feels almost meaningful, almost intimate, almost alive, almost enough. The counterfeit does not need to be perfect. It only needs to keep you busy. This is why the achievement cycle feels so empty after the hit fades. Why validation works for an hour and then demands renewal. Why relationships built on mutual role-playing become exhausting even when nothing obvious is wrong. Why people can spend years building a life that looks desirable and still feel a silent horror in private. They are not failing at the game. They are discovering the game is designed to consume them. And this changes everything, because it reframes suffering. Not all suffering, but a crucial kind of it. Some suffering is not evidence that you are off the path. It is evidence that the path you were given cannot hold the truth of what you are. That restless feeling, that inability to be fully sedated by status or routine, may be Sophia's spark refusing assimilation. In other words, your dissatisfaction may be more sacred than your comfort. That is a radically different lens. It means the goal is not simply to become better adjusted. Better adjusted to what? To a world that rewards image over being, to timelines that crush reflection, to norms that turn people into products, to an economy that monetizes loneliness, then sells identity back to you in pieces. From a Gnostic perspective, many forms of success are actually highly refined forms of amnesia. The person who functions smoothly inside a false order may be more lost than the person whose life cracks open under the pressure of seeing through it. This is where it gets dangerous, because once suffering becomes legible as signal, rather than mere dysfunction, the entire moral framework of conformity begins to wobble. You stop asking only, "How do I fit?" and start asking, "What am I fitting into?" That question alone can unravel years of programming. But the myth does not let you stay at critique. It escalates. Because if the human being carries a spark from beyond the system, then the system must respond. In Gnostic thought, the archons are not passive backdrop. They adapt, they interfere, they counterfeit. They study the soul's weaknesses and exploit them. When read psychologically, this is profoundly accurate. The closer you get to something real, the more subtle the resistance becomes. Not necessarily dramatic evil, often just fog, fatigue, cynicism, sudden impulses to numb out, strange compulsions to return to the old self, crises that seem to erupt exactly when you begin to change. The point is not to become paranoid. The point is to notice the pattern. Systems of unconsciousness protect themselves. If your entire identity has been built around approval, then truth will first arrive feeling like social risk. If your psyche has been structured around performance, then essence will first arrive feeling inefficient. If your security depends on familiar suffering, then liberation will first feel unsafe. This is why people often sabotage themselves just before a breakthrough. The ego would rather remain miserable in the known than dissolve into a larger intelligence it cannot control. Look at how this works collectively. The more people feel spiritually empty, the more culture floods them with substitute intensities. Endless controversy, identity wars, outrage cycles, artificial intimacy with influencers, pseudo-spirituality packaged for consumption. Every hunger gets redirected into a market. Even rebellion is branded. Even healing is monetized. Even transcendence becomes content. That is not accidental. A society built on distraction cannot tolerate direct experience for very long. Direct experience makes people harder to manipulate. A person who has touched inner silence becomes less impressed by spectacle. A person who can distinguish need from programming becomes less profitable. A person who begins to sense the divine within does not submit as easily to false authorities, whether religious, political, cultural, or romantic. But here's the part most people miss. The deepest control system is not oppression alone. It is induced self-mistrust. If the spark within you could be clearly felt, the game would start collapsing. So the psyche is trained to doubt its own depth. Intuition becomes irrationality. Inner knowing becomes naivete. Reverence becomes cringe. Mystery becomes weakness. Everything is arranged so that you will dismiss the one faculty capable of leading you out. That is why Sophia's story becomes more than myth. It becomes a mirror for the split between intelligence and wisdom in modern civilization. We have more information than any society in history, yet less interior authority. We can access infinite data, yet many people cannot sit in a room alone for 10 minutes without discomfort. We know how to optimize attention spans, manipulate emotion, engineer behavior, extend productivity, quantify desire, and weaponize image. Yet we still cannot answer the simplest question: what is a human being for? That is the sign of a civilization ruled by demiurgic intelligence, great technical power, minimal self-knowledge, infinite construction, little orientation. It can build systems, but not meaning. It can produce stimulation, but not wholeness. It can simulate connection, but not communion. It can extend life while hollowing out the experience of being alive. In that sense, the demiurge is not just a figure from a sacred text. He is a pattern of consciousness that reaches its modern climax in a world obsessed with control and increasingly estranged from essence. And here comes the second shock, deeper than the first. Sophia's error was not simply the cause of your imprisonment. It was the birth of interiority itself. Without the fall into separation, consciousness would remain in perfect divine harmony, but it would not know return. It would exist in fullness, but not in awakened remembrance. The wound creates longing. Longing creates depth. Depth creates the possibility of freely chosen reunion. This is not a justification of suffering in some cheap spiritual cliché. It is a far more severe idea. The fracture of reality creates the conditions under which consciousness can come to know the source, not merely by existing within it, but by seeking it from exile. In other words, the human ache for transcendence is not a glitch in reality. It is reality becoming self-aware through loss. That is why the path of gnosis is not blind belief. It is remembrance through experience, not faith in a doctrine, recognition in the marrow. This changes the emotional meaning of the entire myth. Sophia is no longer just the tragic mother of a broken world. She becomes the one whose descent makes intimacy with the divine possible in a new way. The divine is no longer only above, pristine, and untouchable. Through Sophia, divine wisdom enters entanglement, grief, confusion, embodiment, and the long labor of return. That means the holiest part of your life may not be the polished moments when you feel spiritually impressive. It may be the raw moments when the falseness of everything becomes unbearable. When the career stops explaining you, when the relationship built on roleplay starts suffocating you, when the endless optimization of self can no longer distract you from the deeper question. When your life appears to be falling apart, but what is really happening is that the counterfeit center is losing authority. This is where it gets dangerous. Because if the breakdown is actually a summons, then numbing yourself back into normality may be the true disaster. What if the panic is not the enemy? What if it is the soul recoiling from prolonged participation in unreality? What if your exhaustion is not weakness, but a refusal to keep worshiping at altars that never fed you? From there, the Christ principle in Gnostic tradition becomes clearer, not merely a historical savior descending to pay off a cosmic debt, but the force of awakened consciousness entering the field of forgetfulness to guide the sparks home. Christ, in this framework, is not here to make you dependent. Christ is here to make you remember. That is a fundamentally different spiritual psychology. It means salvation is not an external transaction. It is an internal recognition. The kingdom is within not because that sounds poetic, but because the route out of the prison runs through the point where the prison cannot fully reach. The inner spark, the witness, the silent knowing beneath conditioning. This also explains why so much institutional religion has often felt spiritually dead to sensitive people. Any system that places ultimate access to the sacred outside the self can be co-opted by archonic logic. Intermediaries multiply, fear becomes leverage, and obedience replaces transformation. The seeker is kept in permanent dependence. Yet Gnosis says the opposite. The truth is hidden within, precisely because no external authority can own it. That does not mean the path is easy. Direct knowledge is harder than borrowed certainty. To awaken is to confront how much of your life has been organized around avoiding yourself. It means seeing that many of your strongest desires were trained into you, that some of your moral positions were inherited postures, that your self-image has been built through mirrors provided by a culture invested in your confusion. It means grieving the years spent chasing substitutes, grieving the relationships maintained through mutual unconsciousness, grieving the ways you betrayed your own depth to remain acceptable. But here's the part most people miss. This grief is not a detour from awakening. It is one of its forms. Tears can be intelligent. Collapse can be clarifying. To feel the tragedy of forgetfulness is already to be moving beyond it. The soul does not heal by pretending the prison was fine. It heals by recognizing what was lost, what was counterfeited, and what still survives beneath the damage. So, what does the return actually look like in ordinary life? It rarely begins with visions. It usually begins with subtler signs. A growing inability to participate in superficial conversation without feeling split. A quiet disgust after another hour of scrolling. A strange tenderness toward solitude. An increased sensitivity to noise, falseness, and speed. A new reluctance to say things you do not mean. The realization that certain environments feed your persona but starve your essence. The understanding that your chronic busyness has been functioning as anesthesia. At first, these shifts may feel like dysfunction because they interfere with normal performance. You may become less entertaining, less compliant, less interested in climbing ladders whose destination no longer impresses you. But this is not necessarily collapse. It may be discernment. The divine spark begins not by making you extraordinary, but by making unreality harder to tolerate. Modern life interprets that as a problem, because modern life depends on your ability to tolerate what injures you. And this is where the story circles back in the most intimate way. Sophia's error created the world of fragmentation, yes. But Sophia's presence within you is what makes fragmentation unbearable. She is not only the cause of dissent, she is the pressure toward return. That is the new perspective almost no one emphasizes strongly enough. The longing you feel is not a side effect of the myth. It is Sophia moving inside the human soul. Every time beauty devastates you for reasons you cannot explain, every time truth cuts through years of self-deception in a single second, every time you feel homesick for something with no name, that is not fantasy. It is metaphysical memory. It is wisdom remembering itself inside exile. Once you see that, loneliness becomes more complex. It is no longer just the absence of people. It is separation from source felt inside time. That is why no amount of ordinary success can fully cure it. You are trying to solve a spiritual rupture with material rearrangements. No wonder the relief never lasts. So, the real battle is not between good people and bad people in the simplistic moral frame. It is between remembrance and forgetfulness, between direct experience and mediated illusion, between the inner authority of the spark and the outer authority of systems that need you fragmented to survive. The war is subtle because it is fought in perception first. What do you notice? What do you normalize? What do you call yourself? What do you secretly worship? What do you fear losing? The ego, trained by the lower order, keeps saying survival is enough. The spark keeps whispering that survival without truth is another kind of death. This is where it gets dangerous, because once you hear that whisper clearly, you cannot fully return to sleep. You can distract yourself. You can postpone. You can bargain. You can build a prettier cage, but you will know it is a cage. And from that point forward, all your suffering becomes legible in a new way. Not all of it, but enough. enough to make unconscious living feel like betrayal. What remains, then, is not a neat doctrine, but a demand. Can you live in the world without letting the world define the deepest thing in you? Can you participate in society without worshiping its illusions? Can you use identity without becoming trapped inside it? Can you touch matter without forgetting light? That is the Gnostic challenge, not escapism, not theatrical darkness, not the thrill of forbidden mythology for its own sake. It is a more ruthless question. What in you is real before the performance starts? What in you remains when the roles fail, when the audience disappears, when the metrics go silent, when the ambitions thin out, when your private life can no longer be narrated as a brand? That remainder, if you can find it, is where the return begins. Not in a temple, not in a trend, not in another external system promising enlightenment by subscription. In the silent recognition that the deepest part of you was never made by this world, and therefore cannot be completed by it. And yet the final revelation is still not fully spoken, because the Gnostics understood something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. Awakening is not only about escaping the lower order, it may also transform what the lower order is for. If enough sparks remember, then the field changes. The prison becomes a passage. The wound becomes an organ of perception. Exile becomes the condition for a conscious return that could never have happened in untouched perfection. Sophia's mistake, then, is not merely the catastrophic beginning of history. It may be the hidden mechanism by which divine fullness learns to know itself through separation, choice, and remembrance. That does not make suffering small. It makes it charged. It means your life is not just taking place inside the myth. Your perception is one of the places where the myth is still unfolding. Every moment, you refuse a counterfeit. Every moment, you choose presence over distraction, essence over image, truth over comfort, reverence over cynicism. You are not just improving your life. You are participating in the repair of a cosmic fracture older than the stars. So, maybe the question is no longer whether Sophia fell. Maybe the question is whether her descent is happening in you right now as longing, and whether her return is also happening in you as recognition. Maybe the unease you feel when the world demands your total belief is not neurosis, but memory. Maybe your anxiety is not only pathology, but misdirected metaphysical homesickness. Maybe the voice that tells you to keep performing, keep consuming, keep chasing, keep comparing, keep staying busy, keep not looking too deeply, is not your true self at all, but the internal echo of a blind ruler terrified that you might remember the light he cannot create. And if that is true, then the most radical act available to you is not rebellion in the dramatic sense. It is remembrance, stillness deep enough to hear what remains beneath the noise, honesty deep enough to admit what no longer satisfies, courage deep enough to let the false self weaken, attention deep enough to feel the spark before the world names you again. Because once that spark is felt, even faintly, the story changes. The world is still the world. Bills still exist. Grief still visits. Bodies still age. Heartbreak still happens. But the center shifts. You stop asking the system to tell you who you are. You stop expecting endless stimulation to become meaning. You stop confusing visibility with reality. The hidden life becomes more important than the performed one. Discernment sharpens. Desire simplifies. Presence deepens. You begin to sense that awakening is not adding something new to yourself, but removing what never truly belonged. Layer by layer, the counterfeit authority weakens. The inner exile starts to become a path. And somewhere beneath all the noise of modern life, beneath the ego's negotiations, beneath the fear of dissolving, beneath the ancient machinery of distraction, Sophia is still there. Not as a distant mythological figure asking for worship, but as the wounded wisdom inside consciousness itself, calling what is scattered back toward wholeness. You do not have to understand all of it yet. In fact, you cannot. Not from the level of the mind that was shaped by the prison, But if something in you recognized itself in this story, even for a moment, then the return has already begun. What you've just heard is not really a story about the past. It's a map of perception. Sophia's mistake is not just what created the world. It's what made reality feel believable while quietly being incomplete. The system doesn't only trap you with pain, it traps you by feeling normal enough that you stop questioning it. That's the deeper layer most people never reach. The illusion is not obvious. It's comfortable. And this is where it becomes personal. Because if even a small part of you recognizes something in this, then you are not just observing the myth, you are inside it. You are not just living a life. You are carrying a fragment of something that does not fully belong here, trying to remember itself through you. That quiet resistance you feel toward ordinary life might not be confusion. It might be intelligence refusing to collapse into a role. Here's the unsettling insight. What if the real prison was never the world itself, but the version of you that learned how to survive in it? Because if that's true, then awakening is not about escaping somewhere else. It's about seeing through the identity that kept you asleep. So the real question is not, is this story true? The real question is, if you stopped playing the version of yourself this world expects, what would remain? If this shifted something in you, even slightly, just comment one word, remember. And if you want to go deeper into this kind of thinking, stay with me. There's more to uncover.